Greetings and good evening, and welcome to our fourth Cannabis Conversations during COVID-19. My name is Dr. Timothy Fong. I'm professor of psychiatry, and I'm one of the steering committee members of the UCLA Cannabis Research Initiative. Tonight, we welcome in Dr. Donald Abrams from UCSF. Dr. Abrams is a professor emeritus of medicine. He is at UCSF. He's an oncologist with a passion in nutrition and cancer. Tonight, he and Dr. Ziva Cooper will be talking and discussing some of the core questions related to cannabis and cancer, trials and tribulations. So before we begin tonight's program, allow me to introduce just a few housekeeping items. First, if you have not had a chance, please take a look at our website, brand new remodeled website as of fall 2020, cannabis.semel.ucla.edu. Inside the website, you'll also see a spot there under events and videos that has videotaped recording. Can I even use the word videotape? Digital recording of our former cannabis conversations, including our first one on CBD, our second one on pulmonary effects, and last month's on cannabis research. Also, at the bottom, we have a year-end initiative as 2020 comes to a close. Our hope is to raise $100,000 to support cannabis research education at UCLA. If you're interested in learning more about how to make a gift, please contact Jillian Flannery with UCLA Foundation at jflannery@support.ucla.edu. Her phone number is also attached. Again, we have an end of the year $100,000 goal. We will be sending letters out to our on Giving Tuesday to achieve that. Also special tonight, we have, again, a reminder about our Twitter handle at UCLA Cannabis. This was last month's screenshot where we had 56 followers. Now, a month later, I think we're up to almost 80. So we're exponentially getting there, but please follow us on Twitter where the latest news items related to the research at UCLA, as well as research coming from the world of cannabis. Lastly, two more things. We will not be having a cannabis conversation during COVID during Christmas, none in December, to take a time for us to reflect on the year, to spend time with our friends and family as best and as safely as we can, and just basically to give us some time to rest. But we will be back come January 28th, 2021 with a new topic. For anyone interested in specific topics they want to hear related to cannabis, please contact us either through Twitter or through email about topic matters that you'd like to see. So before I like to acknowledge Dr. Cooper and introduce Dr. Cooper, I want to take a brief moment to highlight partly a supporter of our work. A few years ago, I had the pleasure of meeting Kevin and Claudia Bright, and they came to my office talking about their interest specifically on cannabis and cancer. At the time, I knew very little about cannabis and I didn't know what to do with it. But we maintained a relationship, and through the years, I'm so proud to become supporters of their work. Again, thank you, Kevin and Claudia Bright, for supporting our work at the UCLA Cannabis Research Initiative, and particularly for the work we are doing to follow up with your interest in cannabis and its impact on cancer. So with that, let me turn it over to Dr. Ziva Cooper, our director of the UCLA Cannabis Research Initiative, and she will begin our cannabis conversations during COVID with Dr. Donald Abrams. Thank you.
Dr. Fong, thank you so much for a wonderful introduction. We are so excited to have you join our monthly series called Cannabis Conversations during COVID, highlighting the most pressing questions related to cannabis. Today, we'll be talking with Dr. Donald Abrams about his life in cannabis research, where we have a chance to learn about how, as a trained oncologist, he became interested in understanding the effects of cannabis for HIV and also its effects on cancer. By the end of today's conversation, we will have some idea as to what's behind the promising headlines suggesting that cannabis may help treat cancer. And for some personal history, I met Dr. Abrams about 4.5 years ago when working on a committee with the National Academies of Sciences, where 16 of us were tasked with essentially looking at the literature that had been published for the last 20 years on the health effects of cannabis and synthesizing all of it and coming up with some firm conclusions about what we know and what we don't know about cannabis. For me at the time, and still, Dr. Abrams' work always loomed large for me, as he was one of the few people who was doing clinical studies with cannabis, testing the potential medicinal effects of cannabis in patients, which is really hard to do. And we'll hear some of that today. So of course, I was a little intimidated when we first met. But since then, Dr. Abrams has become one of my closest colleagues and a dear friend, someone who I turn to when an exciting paper is published in the field, and somebody who I turn to hear his thoughts on the evolving views of cannabis and cannabinoids as medicine. And I'm so excited to share his wisdom with you tonight. So for the conversation, we invite you to click on the tiles in the upper right corner of your screen to turn on the gallery view to see both of us at all times. Also, feel free to add questions in the Q&A box. So specifically the Q&A box. You may notice that I'm keeping an eye on this box during the conversation. We've already received some questions, and we will try our best to respond to everyone's comments and questions over the course of the hour. So Dr. Abrams, welcome. I'm so excited to have this conversation with you about your findings, how cannabis research has changed since you started in the field, and for you to share with us some insights into how cannabis is now being touted as a promising new anti-cancer agent. So
thank you, Ziva. It's a pleasure to be here, and I do congratulate you for running this series. I think it's a great idea and really hopefully will help promulgate useful information to the listeners.
Thank you. And it's great to have these one-on-one conversations. It's such a treat for me to be able to pick your brain and also be able to address some of the questions that I think a lot of people have. And I want to reflect back about a year ago. I was in San Francisco a little bit before COVID hit, and we were taking a walk with your award-winning puppies. And you were telling me how you became heavily involved in AIDS research in the 1980s and patient care. So even though you were trained as an oncologist, not in infectious disease, this work seemed to play a large role in your cannabis research going forward. Can you share how you became involved in AIDS research and clinical care?
Sure. It was during my training to be an oncologist here at the University of California, San Francisco, that suddenly the first cases of AIDS appeared. And the cases that we saw initially were cancers, Kaposi sarcoma and lymphoma, two malignant diseases. And here I was training to be a cancer doctor, and the first manifestations of what we didn't know was HIV infection at that time were cancers. And interestingly, in the second year of your fellowship, you have to work in a laboratory. And I wound up working in the laboratory of Harold Varmus and Mike Bishop, who studied retrovirology. And of course, retroviruses are what causes HIV. So I was sort of in the right place at the right time. And as a gay man in San Francisco, this pandemic was affecting my community. So armed with my knowledge of retrovirology, I was going to be a blood specialist, a hematologist, but since this disease was cancers, I switched and became an oncologist at the beginning and became an AIDS oncologist, so specializing in cancers that were affecting people living with AIDS.
Wow, I mean, just thinking back at the time, people didn't know much at all about what was causing these cancers and what was causing AIDS. That must have been an incredibly pivotal time to be in the field.
Well, you know, people often ask me to compare this pandemic to that pandemic, and I think they're very yin and yang because, you know, just as you're saying, the duration, I mean, look at this, we might have a vaccine within 9 months, and for HIV, there's, you know, it took us 5 years to figure out what caused it, whereas we knew what caused this before we even saw the disease. So yeah, very yin and yang, and it's ironic that I was attending on the medical service at San Francisco General, Zuckerberg San Francisco General, and my last 2 weeks before I retired was supposed to be April 4th to the 17th. And I actually declined because we were just right at the beginning of this, and I was turning 70, and I didn't think it was a good idea for me to be in the hospital with these patients, which is so ironic because I jumped headfirst into the HIV pandemic, but it did, even then it was really clear that it wasn't transmitted as this infection is in airborne and droplets.
And in San Francisco at the time, I remember you telling me how, the cases there were numerous cases in San Francisco specifically, and it was impacting your community. So it must have had a personal impact as well.
Well, actually, the 4 men that were my partners from age 25 to 39 all died of AIDS. And the last one was my partner when he died, and when I was 39. And one of the things that impacted me was that he used cannabis pretty much every day. And he survived 4 years after his first episode of pneumocystis pneumonia, whereas most people survived 1 year. So when I was tapped on the shoulder to potentially investigate cannabis in patients with HIV, I recalled that experience with Mark, my partner, and said, okay, yeah, I can do that.
So it was actually, so you were with Mark and you saw that he was using cannabis. What was he using cannabis for?
I think for appetite, for nausea, and to chill. He knew he had a life-threatening disease and didn't really drink alcohol, so he wanted some way to decrease his anxiety and depression and stress.
And, it's interesting because around the same time, the FDA was approving synthetic THC. I mean, I think it was around the same time the FDA was approving synthetic THC for AIDS appetite suppression.
So the FDA approved dronabinol and nabilone in 1985 for treatment of chemotherapy-related nausea and vomiting. And then in 1991, they expanded the reason that those drugs could be used to include treating loss of appetite from the so-called AIDS wasting syndrome. And the political issue here is that up until 1992, the federal government, despite saying that that cannabis is a Schedule I substance, meaning a high potential for abuse and no accepted medical use, they were supplying a handful of people with 300 cannabis cigarettes a month. These people had so-called orphan diseases that were felt to be impacted positively by the use of cannabis. And there was a syndrome before we got highly effective antiretroviral drugs called the wasting syndrome, where people living with AIDS, and now by then we knew it was HIV infection, basically wasted away with fever, diarrhea, and weight loss. And there was no treatment for it. And the government got concerned that these thousands, if not tens of thousands of patients would qualify as an orphan disease and would start knocking on the door asking for cannabis, 300 cigarettes a month, like they were giving to these 8 other people. So Bush 1 closed the so-called compassionate use program, and simultaneously the FDA expanded the approval for dronabinol to include treatment of loss of appetite associated with the wasting syndrome. Well, it didn't improve weight, but it improved appetite. And that was enough for them to say, you don't need cannabis, here's your cannabis. And that's when I first started to use dronabinol. I didn't use it in cancer patients. And I realized that just taking Delta-9 THC and putting it in a capsule with sesame oil is not the same as using cannabis.
So I want to get back to this. The research where somebody tapped you on the shoulder, and that's kind of what inspired you to do this research. But just going back in history, the 8 people that were approved to receive the tins of 300 marijuana cigarettes from the farm in Mississippi, what were they taking the cannabis for at the time?
Oh, I remember one of the current living patients, Irv Rosenfeld in Florida, has some bone. He's written books about this, so I'm not going against HIPAA here. He has some bony growth process that causes a lot of pain. And then there's a woman who had very severe blinding glaucoma that couldn't use eye drops that used it. And there are a few other people whose names I know, but I can't remember exactly what their diseases were that they were using these 300 cannabis cigarettes from the government a month to treat. But that program is long gone.
That program.
Yeah.
They still have the tins of marijuana cigarettes, but they give them to researchers like us, right? And so when you mentioned that somebody tapped you on your shoulder to start doing research in this field, but I'm surprised that it wasn't, you know, your experience with Mark, who was using cannabis for 4 years, that didn't kind of pique your interest. Were you not necessarily in the research? No, you were doing research back then.
Well,
you just didn't even think about cannabis?
Well, I was doing research in antiviral drugs, HIV medicines, and I had just published in the New England Journal a study showing that one drug compared to another drug were the same in people who had failed the first AIDS drug, AZT. And so one of my colleagues got a letter from Rick Doblin, who's the president of MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies. And it was addressed to the director of research in the AIDS program at San Francisco General, which I was not actually. But Mark brought it to me because I ran a group of community physicians that was doing research in their practices. And he said, you might be interested in this. Let me just take one step backwards. In 1992, the International AIDS Conference was held in Amsterdam, of all places. It was supposed to be held in Boston, but the United States had blocked people with HIV coming into the country. And so the International AIDS Conference couldn't be held in the United States. So it was moved to Amsterdam. And there I was in my hotel room looking at CNN International. And I saw my friend Mary Rathbun being arrested. Mary was the volunteer of the year for 2 years in a row at San Francisco General AIDS program. She was known as Brownie Mary. She would wheel our patients to X-ray and drop their prescriptions off at the pharmacy. And she would bake brownies for her kids, as she called them. And these were those special kind of brownies. And there she was being arrested while I was in Amsterdam, of all places. So when I got back, there was this letter from Rick Doblin saying a study showing the medicinal benefit of cannabis in HIV patients should come from Brownie Mary's institution, as if she were our dean. So when he gave me the letter, I said, okay, I went to college in the 60s. So I said, let's do it. And, you know, that was a little bit naive because it began a 5-year struggle with the government to be able to get cannabis to study in patients with HIV.
So you mean you couldn't get Brownie Mary's brownies to study in your clinical trial?
The only legal source of cannabis to study is from NIDA, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, right?
And Doblin from MAPS, he was asking you to do the first study in AIDS patients, looking at, I forget, was it pain? Was it increase in appetite?
Wasting syndrome, yeah.
Wasting syndrome.
Yeah, so actually first I sent Rick Doblin the template for how to write a protocol for the University of California Institutional Review Board or Committee on Human Research and said, why don't you give me a draft? And in 1 week, he sent me back a study looking at 3 different doses of brownies. And I said, you know what? I don't think we can do a study for 12 weeks using brownies because they're going to get stale.
That's what he said.
Right. So then,
amongst all the other reasons why you couldn't do it, right?
Yeah. So then he got a cannabis company in Holland to say that they would donate 3 different strains of cannabis for us to use in the study. And that's when my problem started because the government said, no, you can't import cannabis. And Holland said, no, we can't export cannabis unless you have a letter from the government saying it's okay to import it. And the government said, no, we can't give you that letter unless they say it's okay to export it. So it was a Max Escher print, you know. So after a year, somebody told me, you know, you should talk to NIDA, or somebody told me to talk to somebody who said, seek a domestic source. And so I said, what does that mean? And they said, you have to go to NIDA, the National Institute on Drug Abuse. So that began my 2-year conversation or 3-year conversation with Alan Leshner, who at the time was the head of the National Institute on Drug Abuse. And what I learned in that experience was that NIDA has a congressional mandate to only study substances of abuse as substances of abuse. So if you want to study cannabis for its potential harm, NIDA has $150 million a year. But if you want to study cannabis as a potential therapy for something, you must use their cannabis, but they cannot fund such a clinical trial.
So who funded this study?
So I tried twice, unsuccessfully. And then the third time, by the third time, 1996 is when everything changed in HIV because we got active drugs and the wasting syndrome disappeared. But the first drugs that we used that were highly active, the protease inhibitors, were broken down by the enzyme system in the liver that might be impacted by some of the cannabis chemicals. So I sent NIDA a protocol saying I wanted to see if it was safe for patients with HIV on these drugs to use inhaled cannabis. And as long as I was looking for potential harm, then NIDA could fund the study. And I knew somebody that worked very highly up in the National Institutes of Health who told me that every institute wanted to contribute money to fund this study because in 1997, it was a big step forward, or, people were enthusiastic about having this study done. Again, it was Clint, my husband, Clint Werner, who wrote Marijuana Gateway to Health, How Cannabis Protects Us from Cancer and Alzheimer's, calls that my Trojan horse study, because even though we said we were going to look to see if cannabis was safe, and we did, we wanted to see what happened to the patient's immune system, to their levels of the virus, and to the levels of the AIDS drugs in their bloodstream, but we also looked to see what it did to their appetite and their weight. So it was looking for some, potential effectiveness, but none of these patients had the wasting syndrome because that disappeared when they started taking the active drugs.
So the patients in the study were on the active drugs. They were on the protease inhibitors that are helpful in the wasting aspect of HIV. And you were looking at how smoked cannabis on top of those drugs potentially impacted the safety or effectiveness of those drugs, but you were also able to look at these other aspects. And so were you giving people, marijuana cigarettes or joints to take home with them?
No. All of our clinical studies have been done in our inpatient clinical research center at San Francisco General, now called Zuckerberg San Francisco General, because we're studying a Schedule I substance. And that first study comparing smoked cannabis to oral dronabinol to placebo dronabinol, it was a 3-arm study. Patients were, if you will, incarcerated in our clinical research center for 25 days and nights.
Wait, okay, hold on. Before we get to the 25 days and nights stuck on your research center, so you were comparing the smoked cannabis to dronabinol, and dronabinol is?
Just delta-9 THC.
So it's the component of the cannabis plant that is thought to produce some of these therapeutic effects, but there's nothing else in it. It's like Brownie Mary's brownies, but with just the THC.
No, Brownies Mary's brownies had real cannabis. So it's the opposite. The real cannabis that the patients smoked in the cigarettes from NIDA was like her brownies, but different, of course, kinetics of smoking versus eating. Dronabinol is just delta-9 THC, and that's just one single component. That's what had been licensed and approved in 1985 for chemotherapy and then expanded in 92 for the so-called AIDS wasting syndrome.
And so you had some people smoking, and then you had some people taking the oral THC, and then some people on placebo. And they were all hanging out 25 days and nights on your unit.
Well, we did 67 people in the study. Our unit only holds 6 or 8 at a time. So it was done over a number of years. And there were other research is being done at the same time. So I only could have 2 or 3 beds a week.
And what was it like? I mean, were there other studies going on looking at smoked anything at UCSF at the time?
Yeah, Neil Benowitz, who's one of my colleagues and one of my mentors in this, studies the dangers of tobacco smoke. So they did have some rooms in the clinical research center that were aerated with fans that exhausted to the outside for smoking rooms. And so we had to put more fans in to do our study. Unfortunately, despite we have fans that aerate to the outside, it's an oldish hospital and the doors are about an inch above the floor. So the nurses that worked on the unit used to roll up blankets and put them outside the floor when they were smoking. I called it the opposite of college, really.
Right.
They didn't want the smoke in the hallway to interfere with other participants in clinical trials or themselves.
Wow. And was the institution okay with this? Did you have to deal with?
Every study I've done has been done in the clinical research center at Zuckerberg San Francisco General, because we don't know if we give patients, cannabis or cannabis cigarettes to take home, if the government is afraid they're going to divert it to friends and family and not use it. So right. All of our studies are done observed. The nurses look in the window in the room to make sure that the patient is adhering to the so-called Fulton puff procedure, which we use to standardize the dose of cannabis.
So I guess it's nice in a way. You have so much control over all the experimental components of the study, and you probably gathered so much data. You gathered data on sleep. You gather data on how many calories they're taking, when they're eating it. Did you look at other endpoints like intoxication or memory impairing effects?
Well, I mean, we didn't give them any special neuropsychiatric testing, but they did have a side effects questionnaire that the nurses did a few times a day. And you're right that in the clinical research center, it was originally a metabolic center for studying caloric intake. So they do carefully monitor the food. In that first study, we allowed patients to have a refrigerator next to their bed that was locked at 11 o'clock at night. And in that study, we did demonstrate that the patients inhaling cannabis or taking dronabinol gained more weight than the patients on the placebo. So yeah, that was so, and then as the most important thing we looked at was these studies, the impact of the different cannabis, dronabinol, and placebo on the immune system. And there was a fear that cannabis was an immunosuppressant. But in fact, what we found was that the people inhaling cannabis actually had elevations in their T lymphocytes, the building block cells of the immune system that are actually infected by the AIDS virus. So we saw the opposite of what people feared, in that the immune system seemed to be perhaps boosted.
So that's interesting because we're getting to the part. I don't want people to think that we're going too tangential here. We're getting to cannabis and cancer, but I think that as much as we hear about cannabis and cancer, we also hear a lot about cancer and immune function. And I am constantly trying to find data in humans demonstrating the pro-immune effects of cannabis in humans. It seems like a lot of the hypotheses, or a lot of what we see, is really based off of animal studies done looking at the pro-immune effects of THC or CBD in animal models, but there's been very little in humans. But you actually, it sounds like you're one of the few people that actually looked at this under a controlled setting, comparing placebo to THC, and actually finding that there was a positive effect on the immune system.
Yeah, I think we did an extensive battery of immune studies. I wasn't prepared to discuss that tonight because that was done so many years ago, but Barry Brett, may he rest in peace, was the immunologist who did probably the most extensive battery of tests on the immune function in people using cannabis and dronabinol that's ever been done.
And so what did he find? Or I guess I don't
have that at the tip of my fingers at the moment, but my basic understanding, what we wrote in our main paper, was the changes or the improvement in the lymphocyte counts.
Great. So this study was really based off of the potential interaction between cannabis and THC and these other medications that this patient population has. And we're getting a question here about potential evidence for other bad reactions or potential drug-drug interactions that are negative between dronabinol and cannabis and other drugs. But before we get to that question, did you guys find any indication of a drug-drug interaction with the drugs that the patients were using?
No, we were studying nalfinavir and indinavir, which were two old, some of the original protease inhibitors. But it did lead to another study that I got funded by NIDA. In animal models, there was a suggestion that cannabinoids, the active ingredients in cannabis, could boost the pain relieving effect of opiates. So originally, we in California are lucky that the Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research was funded in 1999 with money appropriated in the California state legislature by John Vasconcellos, a former state senator. And they gave the Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research $3 million a year for 3 years to help fund clinical trials looking at the potential benefits of cannabis. And so I got funding to do 2 studies in cancer patients from the Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research, but lost funding in both of those cases because I couldn't enroll patients in those studies. And one of our nurses who specializes in cancer symptom management said, "Donald, you're admitting cancer patients to the hospital when they don't need to be in the hospital." And maybe they're not so altruistic because they realize with their disease, they're going to spend a lot of time in the hospital. They don't want to spend extra time there that they don't have to. But one of the studies that got defunded was to look to see if there was this potential synergy, 1 + 1 = 5 instead of 2 in pain relief when you add cannabis to opiates. So I told the government, I want to see if it's safe to add cannabis to opiates, and then they funded it. And so we did do a study looking to see if there was any interaction between vaporized cannabis, because from the Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research, we got funded to study the so-called volcano vaporizer and showed that it delivered the same amount of THC and everything else to the bloodstream that smoking a cigarette did. So all of our subsequent studies have looked at the vaporizer. So we looked at vaporized cannabis in patients on sustained release morphine or sustained release oxycodone and found, again, that there was no clinically significant effect on the levels of the drug, but there did appear to be a benefit in increasing relief of pain. To my knowledge, there aren't that many other studies looking at the negative interactions between cannabis or its component and other drugs, although there's theoretical fear because, as I mentioned, chemicals in the plant work on that system in the liver that breaks down pharmaceuticals as well.
So it seems like, though, the 2 studies that you've conducted looking at these potential negative effects between drugs, even though it sounds like you hypothesized based on the fact that they're metabolized by the same type of enzyme, you thought there might be a negative effect, but in the end, you didn't end up seeing a negative effect with the combination of these drugs, which is interesting because I think that one thing that I hear a lot about with respect to alerting patients or people about the potential adverse effects of cannabis and cannabinoids is this potential drug-drug interaction. More people are using cannabis and cannabinoids, and a lot of these people are on other medications as well. And so it's something to be mindful of. And do you think, at what point do you think we're going to have enough information to say that it's okay to use cannabinoids or cannabis alongside these other medications? I mean, the list of potential interactions is pages long, right?
Yeah, and also the list of potential cannabis products is now pages long as well. It was much easier when we just got 3.9% THC cigarettes from NIDA, because that was it. Now, what you were just saying, these people are taking highly concentrated oils of CBD or THC, which delivers much more of those chemicals to the bloodstream and to the liver than smoking or vaporizing a little plant. And that concerns me, especially in my cancer patients who are taking these highly concentrated tinctures and oils of CBD or THC, particularly CBD, because that seems to have a more pronounced effect on the enzymes in the liver that break down many of the chemotherapeutic drugs that we use. So this could lead to increased toxicity in patients using those highly concentrated oils in conjunction with chemotherapy.
So that brings us to another point about the widespread use of CBD now. I think that a recent survey indicated that 1 out of 7 US adults is using CBD in some form. And, you know, there's the question of, is it effective for any of the indications that people are using it? And also, is it safe? And in general, you know, people talk about the safety of CBD. It's not intoxicating. You don't have the memory impairing effects like you do with the THC. So it feels like it's safe. But it sounds like you have some concerns about the safety of CBD.
Well, I mean, you already had your whole first show was on CBD, so I don't want to upstage that. But yeah, I'm one of those people that sort of scratches my head and say, you know, how did CBD become a $23 billion industry in the absence of any evidence that it does anything? And we actually conducted a clinical trial in a survey of patients at our integrative medicine clinic in San Francisco, San Diego, and Chicago, and in 10 dispensaries in those 3 cities of patients using CBD dominant products, asking them what they were using, how they were using it, what they used it for, and if it worked. And the respondents were predominantly upper middle class white women, which is who comes to integrative medicine clinics predominantly. And they used it for pain, anxiety, and sleep. And they rated it 8 of 10 in effectiveness. So, you know, is this the only way we can do research now, asking people what you're using and how does it work? Or can we do randomized placebo-controlled double-blind trials anymore? I don't know. But CBD mystifies me because you say it's not psychoactive. And in fact, it changes.
No, it's not intoxicating. It's psychoactive.
It has to be psychoactive. Yeah. But what it does, it actually changes the shape of the receptor that THC binds to. So it works as a sort of antagonist at that receptor site. So that's why THC, when you have a 1-to-1, you get a little bit less of the THC effect because the CBD is changing that receptor so the THC can't bind. So is that a good thing or a bad thing? I don't know. Yeah, I don't know.
Do we know anything about CBD's potential therapeutic effects? Like, could you, when you talk to a patient about, they come to you and they say, you know, I heard CBD can do this and this. What do you tell them? What do you have to hang your hat on with respect to CBD's potential therapeutic effects?
Well, all we have really is the Epidiolex literature, which is in the approved product of CBD that was studied in children with refractory seizure disorders. And in fact, in the European Union, Epidiolex was only approved in conjunction with a conventional anti-seizure medicine, because they believe that the way it's working is by blocking those enzymes in the liver that I've spoken about so many times, so that it doesn't break down the anti-seizure medicine and it allows a higher dose of that to accumulate in the blood. And that's what decreases the seizures in the children, not the CBD. Prior to these studies in children, very few studies. The largest was in people with social anxiety disorder. 12 people got CBD and 12 got placebo prior to a simulated public speaking event. And those who got CBD were less anxious. And that's pretty much it. You know, there's not a lot in the world literature with positive effects from CBD in large placebo-controlled clinical trials. But it's really caught on fire for sure.
Right. I mean, especially with, you know, pain. I think pain and anxiety and sleep disruption are the 3 most popular indications for which people report using CBD. And, you know, if I wasn't in this field, I would think that there was loads of studies looking at CBD for pain, for cancer pain, for chronic pain. But what you're saying is that we don't really have much data there.
Well, we don't. I mean, you saw that recently there was the American Pain meeting, and some group did a Delphi study where they asked a lot of experts and then they asked them again. And they said that you should start with 5 milligrams of CBD and not go to more than 40. And Rachel Pairube is an endocannabinologist, a woman in Uruguay who's been having access to cannabis for her patients for many years. And she's told me that CBD is only beneficial for pain that's related to inflammation. And otherwise, it's not particularly useful. And the minimally effective dose, according to Rachel, is 80 milligrams. So again, I think we have a real void of knowledge about CBD.
So tell me about your experience with cancer patients and research. It sounds like you haven't really looked at CBD much, if at all, right now. It seems like you've CBD. No, you've concentrated mostly on cannabis and THC, and you've had a couple of protocols that you intended to look at indications in cancer patients, but have any of these, it sounds like you had some difficulties with recruiting cancer patients. Were you successful in completing a trial with cancer patients looking at cannabis and cannabinoids for cancer itself, tumor growth, or symptoms of cancer or chemotherapy?
So the Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research funded the study that I wanted to do, looking at adding cannabis to opiates in patients with breast and prostate cancer who had bone pain from cancer that spread to their bone. And I couldn't enroll patients. And then they funded a study that was going to be my first ever outpatient study in patients who have received a first cycle of chemotherapy and had a lot of delayed nausea. And we were going to bring them a cigarette, a pill, both, and one or both would be placebo. So they would get either real cannabis and placebo dronabinol, real dronabinol and placebo cannabis, or 2 placebos. And we're going to see the effect on delayed nausea. We enrolled 8 people out of the 80 that we needed. And then a pill came out for delayed nausea. And no oncologist wanted to refer their patients to that study. Well, I thought that the interaction study between opioids and cannabinoids was so important that when I sent it to NIDA saying I want to see if it's safe, because I am a cancer doctor, I said, for cancer patients with pain. So the study got funded. I enrolled 1 cancer patient, no more. So I said, okay, I'm going to change it to any patient with any pain. And that's how we completed that study. But I have been an oncologist in San Francisco for 38 years. And I have seen day in and day out patients with cancer benefit from the use of cannabis for nausea, for appetite, for sleep, for anxiety, for depression, and pain. There isn't a day that goes by where I don't recommend cannabis to a patient with cancer if they're not already using it. I do live in San Francisco. Many people have used cannabis. And for those people who claim that cannabis cures cancer, I always say, I've been an oncologist in San Francisco for 38 years. And I'd venture to say that most of my patients have used cannabis. If cannabis cured cancer, I would have a lot more survivors.
Wow, that's a powerful statement. I think that speaks volumes about, your own experience treating people, seeing them day in and day out. And for you, it doesn't sound like you think that there's much promise.
Let's be honest. So I'm talking about smoking cannabis. Now, what about those highly concentrated tinctures and oils that we mentioned previously? Again, most of my patients that are out there on the web saying they cured their cancer with these oils and tinctures forget that they also had surgery and chemotherapy. So I think that there is a little amnesia that can be, my dear friend and colleague Manuel Guzman in Madrid, has a laboratory that studies the effect of cannabinoids on metabolism. And the most metabolically active cells in the body are the brain. So they would grow up a rat brain and they would add cannabinoids and see what happens. And they said, maybe we can do our research faster if we grow up a brain tumor. So they grew up a rat brain tumor and they added cannabinoids and everything died. They said, oh, maybe we did something wrong. So they did it again and everything died. So they said, well, maybe it's a bad batch of cannabinoids. So they went back to the normal brain and everything lived. So since that time, Manuel's lab has done elegant research looking at the mechanisms of how cannabinoids kill brain tumor cells growing up in a test tube. Now, as we know, one of the most densely populated receptors in our brain is the so-called cannabinoid 1 or CB1 receptor. So it would make sense that if you add something that's going to complex with that receptor, maybe it's going to have some impact. And what they show is that that interaction causes programmed cell death, where the cells commit suicide. And they've also demonstrated that adding cannabinoids to tumor cells decreases something called vascular endothelial growth factor, or VEGF, which makes new blood vessels form to feed tumors. And that's what a very expensive drug that we use in cancer care, bevacizumab, also does. And they also demonstrated in their lab that cannabinoids block another enzyme that allows cancer cells to become invasive and spread. So the data is really elegant, but it's all in the test tube. And this hasn't been studied in people. Well, very slim studies have been done in people to this point.
Before we get to the people part, so, I mean, you just gave us a wealth of information about the potential positive or anti-tumor effects of cannabinoids. In Manuel's lab, was this mostly with THC, or was it with, you know, CBD? Was it a combination of all the different components of the cannabis plant?
It's a very good question. No, it's, you know, they make laboratory cannabinoids that are synthesized, and that's what people use in their laboratories. But I think Manuel subsequently went on to use THC alone in his follow-on studies. Although now in his next study, he's using THC CBD because you pretty much have to.
And does he hypothesize that there's going to be different effects? You briefly touched on the fact that THC and CBD act very differently at this cannabinoid receptor. So I would imagine that, does he also think that CBD and THC would have different effects, complementary effects?
Well, the first study that he did in humans, he went to the Canary Islands and he found 9 patients who had recurrent glioblastoma, the most aggressive.
Wait, I don't want to get to that part yet. Hold on.
Oh, okay. Well, that's how I can answer the question.
Oh, okay, yes. So I didn't realize that he did this as well. He went to the Canary Islands.
He did, and he found 9 people and he dripped THC by way of a catheter into their brain tumors. I told him, Manuel, we don't treat brain tumors topically. But the reason I'm bringing it up is because there was no difference in patients who got the THC drip compared to those who just got chemotherapy. But biopsies from their brains, when he added THC, it inhibited the growth of those cells. Later on, Jahan Marsu demonstrated that if you added CBD to the THC, it augmented that inhibition more. So maybe it doesn't interfere with THC, maybe it makes THC more potent. I think the answer is we don't know.
It might have like a complementary effect.
Again, that's all still in the test tube. And, you know, I was an AIDS doctor for many years, and I always say gasoline and soap suds kill the AIDS virus, but we wouldn't use either of them therapeutically.
And what about different type of tumor cell lines? Like you're talking about tumors in the brain. Does it matter where the tumor is in the body? Could cannabinoids have a potentially different effect depending on what type of tumor it is?
That's
in the test tube?
It's an excellent question. And there are 2 answers to that. Ladin did a study looking at different tumors, and some have overexpression of the CB1 receptor and some have decreased expression of the receptor. Sometimes that equates to more aggressive tumors, sometimes it's less aggressive tumors. So it's sort of across the board and we don't know. Didi Meiri has a laboratory in Israel where he grew up 12 different cancer cell lines, sometimes from the same organ. So like 2 prostate, 2 breasts, and he had 12 different cannabis products that he added to these cell lines. And sometime the cannabis product inhibited the prostate cancer in one of the cell lines, but not the other one. So I think we're still at an infancy level in trying to understand the effect of cannabis and its components on cancer cells. And most of that work is still being done in test tubes and not in humans.
You mentioned the Canary Island study. And since then, has there been any studies that to you are impressive and speak to this point? Or has it been just really hard to do this research in humans as of yet?
So the company that makes Epidiolex, the pure CBD that was approved for children with epilepsy, also makes another drug called nabiximols, which is a whole plant extract with a 1-to-1 ratio of THC to CBD that's delivered as an under-the-tongue spray. It's licensed and approved in Canada, the United Kingdom, the European Union, Australia, and New Zealand for treatment of spasticity associated with multiple sclerosis. They did a study in 21 people with glioblastoma, again, the most aggressive brain tumor. 12 sprayed nabiximols under their tongue, 9 sprayed placebo. And at the end of the study, at 1 year, 83% of the patients with the recurrent brain tumor receiving chemotherapy and nabiximols were alive, compared to only 53% of the ones receiving placebo in addition to their chemotherapy. And that was statistically significant. It has been reported in February of 2017 as a press release from the company, and then presented at the American Society of Clinical Oncology as an abstract in June of 2017, but the article has not yet appeared in the published medical literature. So we await that with interest.
I mean, that sounds like promising findings.
Well, again, it's 21 people, so not what we call a huge study, but it is the most promising finding that cannabinoids or cannabis has any impact on people living with cancer. But again, it's brain tumors, and that's where the CB1 receptor is so heavily concentrated.
Right. So I guess we'll have to wait for that to come out and for more studies to come out. So it sounds like in your patients, people are using cannabis and cannabinoids, and you feel like it's helpful for certain symptoms related to cannabis and to chemotherapy. So sleep, pain, anxiety, nausea, but you're not entirely convinced, or at this point, you just don't think the data are there yet related to the potential that cannabis could cure cancer, the tumor itself.
Only 23% of oncologists ever use the word cure in their conversations with patients. So cure cancer. Cancer is like 160 different diseases. So I don't think we're going to find one thing that's going to impact all of them in the same way. Yeah.
So just to close, we talked a lot about the different products that are available, people using CBD, high strength THC, what's actually been studied. We had a question about, the fact that most of the studies that are done with cannabis now are done with very low potency cannabis, but people are using very high strength cannabis now. We have drug-drug interactions that we have to think about. So do you have any closing statements regarding the health effects of cannabis and cannabinoids? Any take-home points regarding the promise of cannabis or primary health concerns that the audience should keep in mind when thinking about the intersection between cannabis and cancer and other health indications?
So the most widely prescribed anti-nausea medicine constipates our patients. And I find people living with cancer or people who feel that part of them have died or they're dying like to have normal bodily functions. And I have patients who have foregone the use of this anti-nausea medicine and have done quite well using cannabis. I ask all of my cancer patients, what brings you joy? And the number of cancer patients that tell me that gardening brings them joy is not insignificant. I think if you feel that part of you is dying or you're dying, that the ability to bring life out of the ground is a blessing. And if you can grow your own medicine, that's very empowering. So I encourage my patients to use cannabis. Ilana Braun at Harvard did a study that most oncologists have conversations with their patients, but only 30% feel that they know enough about cannabis to be able to discuss it intelligently with their patients. I wrote a paper, should oncologists recommend cannabis? And the last line of the abstract was, I don't think that this is an intervention that requires a package insert. I think most patients probably can figure out how to use cannabis without having their oncologist tell them. And I encourage them to do so because it's quite beneficial, if only for stress. I mean, we do feel that stress is a negative impactor on the immune system. Stress is adrenaline or epinephrine, which kills your lymphocytes, and stress is cortisol, which is a steroid hormone, which is an immune suppressant. So even if you're just using cannabis to decrease the stress of your diagnosis or your survivorship stress, I think it's, again, infinitely healthier than alcohol, personally.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Abrams. It was wonderful to have you here. And we have so many other questions to cover. I feel like we're going to have to bring you back and talk more in depth about these topics.
2020.
So I want, in 2021, yes, maybe in person then. So I want to take the time to thank each and every one of you for joining us today, your insightful questions. And I'm sorry that we couldn't get to all of them today. And to the Semel staff and audiovisual team for helping with the technology, and the UCLA Cannabis Research Initiative staff for organizing this event. As you know, the programming is free and open to the community, which we do intentionally. The UCLA CRI does rely heavily on philanthropic support to conduct cutting edge research and educational programs. Our goal is for you to find our webinars educational and insightful, and that they provide important information to the community about the potential therapeutic and adverse effects of cannabis and cannabinoids. In our follow-up email, we will provide a link to the recorded event and include a donation information for your consideration to support the good work we do at the Cannabis Research Initiative. Your participation in these events and your support are incredibly important and valuable to us. We sincerely appreciate both your time, thank you for joining us today, and your generosity. We look forward to having you join us in January 2021 for our next Cannabis Conversations during COVID. Until then, stay healthy and have a wonderful holiday season. Thank you so much.